We have a great program for you this evening. It features not only Steve Weisman, who's written the best book to come out in years about the Jewish experience and the foundations of Judaism in the United States, but also another veteran journalist and prominent Washingtonian, Sally Quinn, who's going to be in conversation with Steve. Steve's book, The Chosen Wars, tells the story essentially of how Judaism in America was transformed from old world religious traditions into the modern day Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox branches. This history was nothing if not fractious. In fact, for those of you still collecting SAT words, Steve, as early as page 2 of his introduction, writes about the vociferous tendencies of the Jews. Vociferous. You all can look it up. Anyway, what makes the Chosen Wars both an important and entertaining book are at least two things. One is how Steve connects this religious transformation of Judaism to the history of America itself. He portrays the Jewish evolution here as a distinctly American phenomenon. The second is Steve's ability to tell a story, drawing on skills honed over his many years as a journalist. Steve fills his book with lots of illuminating anecdotes and vivid profiles of key rabbis, activists, and other Jewish figures. As many of you no doubt know, Steve was a longtime staff member of the New York Times, where he served as a foreign correspondent in Japan and India, covered the White House and State Department, did a stint as chief international economics correspondent, and sat on the editorial board, among other assignments. He's also written several books on tax wars, globalization, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And for the past decades, he's been an executive with the Peterson Institute. Now, Sally, as the creator of and guiding hand behind the popular online forum on faith, has become very accustomed over the past decade since the forum was launched to exploring matters of religion. And I'm sure she and Steve are in for a very lively discussion this evening. Sally herself was here at P&P last fall to speak about her most recent book, Finding Magic, about her own remarkable life. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming both Steve and Sally.
Thank you, Brad. I have to say that yesterday I was talking to my friend Richard Cohen, the columnist, and I was telling him that I was going to interview Steve today, and what should I ask him? And he said, well, I think the first thing you should say is to say, Steve, I never knew you were Jewish. I would also like to say that my husband, Ben Bradley, loved Steve Weisman. Steve was one of his favorite people in the world, and Ben always, when Steve walked in the room, he just lit up, and he would always run over, put his arms around Steve, kiss him on the cheek, and say, "Booby." My son, Quinn Bradley, is an amateur genealogist, and about 6 or 8 months ago, he came running into me and he said, Mom, and I said, what? He'd been doing the family history. He said, we're Jewish. I said, we are? He said, yes. He said, I've traced our heritage back to a man named Joshua Lorky in 1400, a Sephardic Jew in Spain, who was the physician to Queen Isabella. And so I was thrilled, of course. And so I told Steve that I was Jewish and that I had traced my heritage back to Joshua Lorky. And Steve said, I knew it. Now, I just want to say this book is really fascinating, and you don't have to be Jewish to really love this book because it is so interesting and tells you a part about American history. I learned so much from reading this book, and for one thing, Christopher Columbus was Jewish. Who knew? I mean, yeah, Christopher Columbus.
Maybe.
Trying to get away from the Inquisition. And also, Abraham Lincoln might have been Jewish. Maybe. Okay, but still, there are these little nuggets in there. But, I mean, the book is filled with so many vivid stories and personalities, as Brad said, and just really funny and amusing incidents and lots of fist fights and and geschreying, I guess you would say. But I would like to ask you, Steve, because, I mean, you and I have been talking about this book and religion ever since we've known each other, but particularly this book. And I have always known, and you started out as a totally secular Jew. You just weren't interested in religion. You didn't take any part in religion. It wasn't interesting. You were from L.A. So, okay.
Even worse,
No,
Beverly Hills.
Okay. There's some observant Jews in LA, aren't there?
Yeah, but they observe different things.
But what fascinated me is, I mean, you've always written about economics and politics and all of that. Why, given your background, would you want to write a book about Judaism?
I thought you'd never ask. First, thank you all for coming. Thank you to Brad and Lissa for inviting me, and to Brad for that lovely introduction. And thanks to Sally, who is such a dear friend and supporter of this book, and for at least 15 years every time I see her, has done what you're never supposed to do with a friend who's an author, which is, where's the book? How's it going? So why did I write this book? And it's true that I am, if you were to shake me in the middle of the night and say, who are you? I do see myself as a political reporter. It was my first love was covering elections and political conflicts. So the first reason that I wanted to write this book was that I think that religion is so important, and yet it's and it's so filled with conflict that there was room to write a narrative history that would read like a great political story. And that's what I tried to do in this book. And so I searched out episodes that were revealing, that were full of conflict, of larger-than-life personalities. And once when I found out that in 1850, the rabbi of a congregation in Albany, Isaac Mayer Wise, who later went on to be the founder of Reformed Judaism, or one of the founders, got into actually a fist fight with the president of his congregation on the bema, on the pulpit. The brawl that erupted had to be cleared by the Albany police. And I thought to myself, what could that have been about? And it turns out that it was about practices, keeping kosher, people violating the Sabbath. He tried to fire the kosher butcher. But the biggest issue was over... Wasn't the kosher butcher also doing circumcisions on the side? That was a common practice in those days. The fact that the biggest dispute, source of that dispute, was over whether or not there was going to be a personal Jesus-like Messiah to come and return the Jews to Zion. And I just, from there, went down a rabbit hole about all these fascinating issues, and I just wanted to tell the story. Now, the second reason that I wrote this book is because, as we all know, we're in an era of conflict of all religions, but including and especially Judaism. I mean, we've reached a point where Jews on one side of the spectrum don't recognize that Jews on the other side are even Jews. And of course, those conflicts are over still practices, religious liberty, gay marriage, all these things, and of course, Israel. And I wanted to write a book that would tell readers that the history of Judaism is the history of conflicts within Judaism, going all the way back to ancient times, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. But I focus on these conflicts in the 19th century that led to the vociferous breaking apart of Judaism tell them what that word means. Well, it's like fission, it's like you think of nuclear fission, it's breaking apart. And so the third reason that I wanted to write this book was really personal, and that gets to the premise of your question, which is that I did grow up in a secular household. Someone once joked when I moved to New York, you were bar mitzvahed in Wilshire Boulevard Temple. You must have been bar mitzvahed in Latin. And it wasn't until I was a young adult that my life kind of changed by my best childhood friend deciding abruptly to become an Orthodox Jew and invited me to spend time in his seminary in Jerusalem. And I traveled around Israel for a couple of weeks and really I was shocked at how ignorant I was about the Talmud and the oral law and all these concepts of traditional Jewish law. But the more I learned about traditional Judaism and the more I wanted to learn, the more I realized that it was not for me. I was not going to become an Orthodox Jew like my dear friend. And I then wanted to learn about the pioneers in the beginning in the Enlightenment in Europe, but then in full flower in the United States, who were brave to try and redefine Judaism and bring it into the basic concepts and believe that you could be a Jew without being strictly observant in diet and dress and keeping kosher and keeping the Sabbath. And it was a personal journey for me to find in American history the people who argued over this. And I came to admire them tremendously, including the traditionalists who fought to retain the traditions.
Well, I learned in your book that the first Jews who came to this country were 23 Sephardic Jews who came in 1654. I don't think that people have any idea that it was that early, and there were so few. And it seems to me that starting with the Sephardic Jews who came first, and then later on there were like 2 million Germans. Jews came from Europe, and so that there was that distinction between the Sephardic Jews and their customs and rituals and habits, and the Germans and the clashes that they had. But what struck me was how people wrestled with the difference between the moral teachings of Judaism and what's in the Bible, and following the actual literal words of the Bible. And it seemed that it sort of broke into 3 groups, finally: the Reform, which came later, the Orthodox, and the Conservative. So talk to me a little bit about how they sort of divided up between first the Sephardics and then the Ashkenazis, and then the sort of Reform and Conservative and Orthodox.
Sure. Well, the first Jews, as you said, they actually came from Brazil, from the coastal town of Recife, which was taken over by the Dutch, and there was a large Jewish community in Holland who then established themselves in Brazil, but then the Portuguese seized that community, and the Portuguese were still persecuting Jews, so they escaped and sailed almost possibly accidentally into New York Harbor, as you say, in 1654, and they founded the congregation Shearith Israel, which still exists on Central Park West. It's the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. And it is Orthodox. If you go there today on the High Holy Days, you'll see that people wear top hat and tails on the High Holy Days and tennis shoes. So that was the first division, you're right, between those two tribal, ethnic origins. But of course, there were many different ethnic divisions among Jews, Polish and Hungarian, and they formed their own societies. But I think the answer to your question has to do, and I love this aspect of American Judaism because it has to do with trends that were underway starting at around 1800. Well, really going back to the 18th century Enlightenment figures who were the founders of the United States, but it just became increasingly difficult for any adherents of any religion to take the Bible literally once the discoveries of science, geology, paleontology, cosmology turned the history of the universe upside down. You could no longer believe that it was that the universe was 6,000 years old. So how to come to terms with being religious was a struggle that was occurring among Protestants, more Protestants than Catholics, but also Jews in the 19th century. So in the Second Great Awakening, the Transcendental Movement, and the Jews could not help but be influenced by these debates. They were influenced also by the new science of literary criticism of the Bible, which really did not start until around 1800. It started in Germany when people actually discovered, oh my gosh, the Bible, the Torah, how could it have been the word of God handed down to Moses if Moses' death is depicted in the Torah? It just, people began to see the logical inconsistencies of reading the scripture literally. And so they had to come to terms, they had to find the moral precepts that underlie these stories. You know, Christopher Hitchens, one of his great lines, the late great Chris Hitchens, who I'm sure has been here many times at this forum, says that the Bible is Bronze Age folk tales from the most benighted region of the world. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, they are Bronze Age folk tales, but they're beautiful. They're compelling. We still want to read them. We still want to invoke them because why? Because the God of those tales is imperfect. There are contradictions. And I think the Jews of the 19th century embraced that idea of Judaism and actually found strength in that idea. Culminating, but the Reform movement didn't start out as a Reform movement. It started out as an Americanizing movement. The Jews in the 19th century wanted to form an American Judaism. They wanted to bring American values to Judaism, not just the superficial ones of making the services like church services, having men and women sit together, which had never happened, and change the whole relationship between families and their congregations. But they also wanted to democratize Judaism. I mean, they wanted the congregations to decide what their practices were going to be. This culminated in the establishment of a reform movement in the late 19th century, but within a year, the traditionalists carried out kind of a counter-reaction and established a conservative seminary, Jewish Theological Seminary, in the 1880s. And out of that division, more in the 20th century, grew the Orthodox and conservative divisions.
How much of moving away from Orthodox, moving away from the conservative Judaism into Reform Judaism had to do with people wanting to be assimilated? I mean, you talk about wanting to Americanize Judaism, but I'm talking about being assimilated in their personal lives, socially assimilated, being able to mix with people outside of their own religion.
I think that was a major factor. They wanted to be Americans as well as Jews. They wanted to be a part. There's, the phrase I've used, but I borrowed it from other scholars. They wanted to be a part of America, but they wanted also to be apart from America a bit. So that was the struggle through the 19th century. But a lot of it, as you suggest, was practical. They couldn't, there was a whole generation of peddlers who were out on their own, out in the countryside. They couldn't observe the dietary rules. They couldn't keep 2 sets of dishes. They couldn't, they had to work on the Sabbath because the stores were closed on Sundays, so they couldn't earn a living without keeping their stores open on Saturdays. So a lot of it was practical, but a lot of it also was the embrace of America and their new identity as Americans, which was why Isaac Mayer Wise really wanted to create an American Judaism before he as the forerunner for what later became Reform Judaism.
Well, some of the stories in there I loved. One, there's the South Carolina where they put the organ. That was a huge deal. I mean, I would never have known that was a big deal to put an organ in a synagogue or a temple. And that was another thing about that they began to use the word temple because they wanted to make sure that people understood. They wanted to claim that it wasn't any longer that they wanted to go back and restore the temple and live in Israel. They wanted their synagogue, their place of worship in this country to be the temple. So that became a word that they used more and more often. But why an organ? What was the significance of that?
Well, the organ was actually started as a matter of controversy in Europe, in the German-speaking countries. And when I was doing research on this, I must say I just had a blast reading the arguments about the organ in Europe, which then became replicated in Charleston, South Carolina. But the arguments against an organ are, first, well, it's like a machine, and an organ is like a whistle that compressed air is forced through it. And the traditional Judaism held that that violated the Sabbath prohibition against work or operating any kind of mechanism or machinery. But then other rabbis would point out, and yet there are many passages in the Bible that say that Jews created beautiful music with musical instruments during the Sabbath. So they engaged in these arcane technical arguments that I have to say I just loved, exploring them. They just were so interesting to me. But in South Carolina,
which, by the way, had the largest Jewish community in the United States.
In the United States in the 1840s, 1830s. And Charleston was a big trading center and a lively intellectual center. And there was a huge fire in Charleston in the 1830s that burned down half the downtown, including several houses of worship and including the synagogue. So when they rebuilt the synagogue, the faction that wanted the organ voted to install it. And this set off an absolute furor. There were divisions. People broke away. There was an organ faction. There was a non-organ faction. They tried to reach an accommodation to share the place. But eventually, no surprise, you probably can guess, it went to court. There was each side hired, incredibly prominent lawyers. The anti-organ faction actually hired a guy named Meminger, who was featured in my first book because he was later became had one of the worst jobs in American history, which was Treasury Secretary of the Confederacy. But it went all the way up to the highest court. And the reason that decision was important was not because he ruled in favor of the Organ faction, but because he ruled that the state has no stake, has no say in how religions are going to organize themselves. And this was a powerful statement for religious freedom in the United States, but especially for Jews who, when they lived in Europe, were accustomed to the states where they lived to defer to the rabbis to set the rules for the Jewish community. In the United States, it was going to be different. It was going to be the democratic processes of each congregation, and the state was not going to enforce the writ of the rabbis. Now, what state in the world today defers to the rabbis to enforce civil laws?
Israel.
Right.
So, well, there's a couple of things. There's so many things I want to ask you, but you brought up Israel, so why don't we talk about Israel? Because even in those days when Israel didn't exist, there was still this idea of Palestine and the temple and all of that kind of thing, which then, once Israel was founded, became a huge issue. And today, American Jews are really divided over their views about Israel. I mean, as you pointed out in your book that something like 70-something% of Israelis are, I think you would say, red state.
Yeah.
and much fewer people, Jews in this country, or more Jews in this country are blue state. And so the interesting thing to me is, and I'm going to diverge a little bit because you talk about when we were talking about the morality of Judaism and how it went from being sort of following the Bible to doing good works, and the idea of tikkun olam, which is repairing the world. I always thought that was an ancient concept, repairing the world, tikkun olam. But as it turns out, it's not. It's a fairly recent concept.
Right.
And so, and sort of social justice. So this is obviously a conflict that has been going on for a long time in Jews in America, but really reaching a peak when you start talking about Israel and the response to the Palestinians. How much time do we have on that?
Well, one of the things that you mentioned is just to explain what we meant by tikkun olam. It's an ancient phrase. I guess it's in the Mishnah. So the phrase itself has mystical implications in the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. It refers to the origins of the universe and vessels breaking apart, and you do mitzvahs and you repair the universe and restore it to a kind of primordial state, which only it does mean repairing the world, but only in the last 50 or 60 years has that term been adopted by the reform movement to refer to the cause of social justice. I mean, I got a lot of comments from people saying when I wrote that tikkun olam is an ancient phrase, and I called it a neologism, and maybe that's not the right word, but it is a kind of hijacking of an ancient term to apply to modern ethical precepts. Now, in terms, Jews have throughout, since the fall of the temple, which fell twice in antiquity, first to the Babylonians and then to the Romans, have pray. It's been an essential ingredient of Judaism to pray for a restoration of the temple and and actually, if you see Maimonides' precepts, not only to pray for the restoration of the temple, but to even pray for the restoration of the house of David, the kingdom of David, and the return of animal sacrifices, which is what Judaism was before the fall of the temple. It was a religion of animal sacrifices.
But you're saying that some Orthodox Jews in this country still
yes,
believe it.
absolutely. Yeah. And Orthodox Jews still pray for a Messiah to come and deliver the Jews back on the, in the Day of Days. And there are various, if you go into Orthodox communities and they come up to you and say, in Brooklyn, "Are you Jewish?" And then they grab you and have you come in and put on tefillin and pray. That's because they think that praying will hasten the day that the Messiah will come and bring the Jews back to Israel. So the pivotal moment in the 19th century was when American Jews said, "No, America is our Zion." I mean, we are in the promised land. We are going to discard those prayers. And they actually took them down from the walls of the synagogues. And one more little footnote to this that I found fascinating is that there was a counter reaction to this, to the discarding of this idea. And this is really interesting, but in the 1870s, I guess it was, a group of traditionalist Orthodox Jews in Philadelphia were so upset about the decline of the interest in restoring the temple that they took this obscure or secondary holiday called Hanukkah, and they decided to make it more central to Judaism. And they had a big Hanukkah celebration, not because maybe they wanted to have a holiday, as we now know, that competes with Christmas and all of that. But they wanted to bring back the emphasis, because Hanukkah was about the story of the Maccabees in whatever it was, 160 or so BC or BCE. For a period in the Hasmonean dynasty, restoring the temple and the story of the Festival of Lights, lasting 8 days and all of that. But Hanukkah was a means for the Orthodox community to bring back the idea that, yes, for Jews, the centrality of the temple and restoring the temple remains central to Judaism.
I want to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism. And I was stunned at how many Jews actually fought in the Civil War. I think there were like 2,000 or 3,000 from the South and 6,000 from the North. But even when they fought for each different side, there was still a lot of anti-Semitism, even toward those people who had fought for the cause. And you talk about how there was a sense of being the chosen people, and how that obviously was an issue for a lot of people who were not Jewish, thinking that Jews were sort of saying, we're the chosen people. We're in Darwinian terms, we're the survival of the fittest, and we're the fittest, and therefore here we are. And that contributed to anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism still remains today in this country. And I mean, there were periods when it wasn't so strong, and it's sort of cyclical. But how do you explain anti-Semitism? Well, let me ask you an easier question. How do you explain how, because the Jews in this country, at least particularly the Reform Jews, did so much to Americanize and to assimilate, that there still remains this sense of anti-Semitism, even when they fought in the wars?
In the Civil War, yeah. Well, it never dies, as we've now discovered, and I see Jonathan back there, my namesake, who explored this in a recent book, but it never really dies. But the Civil War was a real watershed for American Jews because it really integrated them into American society in this dramatic way. They did fight on both sides, and historians say, well, that was just an example of Jews wanting to fit in. I mean, the Jews in the Confederacy were as fiercely loyal to the Confederacy as anyone there. And as you may know, I used to have a trick question when I was covering the State Department, which was, who is the first Jewish Secretary of State? And everybody would always say, well, Henry Kissinger. And I'd always say, no, it was Judah Benjamin, who was the Secretary of State of the Confederacy. Still, there was anti-Semitism on both sides. On the North, General Grant, General Order Number 11, ordered the evacuation or the eviction of Jews from occupied territories. He saw them as corrupt smugglers and black marketeers, in part because they were in league with his father, who he didn't get along with, and Judah Benjamin was the focus of anti-Semitism polemics on both sides. The Confederates blamed him for the failure of the war, and in the North, they saw him as the evil, paymaster of the Confederacy. And Benjamin was one of the few people who actually had a distinguished career after being in the Confederacy. He managed to get out of the country before the war was over and went to England and had a distinguished career as a jurist. And he's buried in Paris at Père Lachaise.
Why do you think that, I think you said in your book there's something like 4.5 million Jews in this country today, or 5 million?
Yeah, that's the estimate.
I don't see how that's possible, since everybody I know is Jewish. I found that stunning. And it seems to me, I've always compared the Jews with the Mormons, because the Mormons are missionaries. They go out and they proselytize and they convert people, and Jews don't do that. Why is that?
Well, actually, Jews have a very mixed view about conversions. Even today, it's a big controversy. But you're right, Jews don't convert, and they're very suspicious about anyone who wants to convert. And there was a big debate in the 19th century over whether or not, in order to convert, you had to have somebody, even an adult male who wanted to convert, had to be circumcised. And David Einhorn, who was a liberal on almost every one of his attitudes, was one of those who argued that this would be a disincentive. I don't think he used that word, but and he favored that you had to have a ritual circumcision. So Jews don't seek converts, except for those people in Williamsburg who grab you if you were ever to go there and try and get you to, put on tefillin and all of that. I mean but they do that because they think if they can convert secular Jews into religious Jews, it'll hasten the Messiah.
I think we only have time for a couple more questions, and then we'll open it to the floor. I wanted to ask you, what was your sort of main takeaway from writing this book? I mean, were you surprised or shocked, or did it confirm things that you already knew? What did you come away with?
That's. I think the biggest discovery was when I slapped my head one day and said, Judaism is an American religion. And my dear friend Erica Brown, who is one of my mentors, who is Orthodox, really quarreled with that concept and said, "What are you talking about? Judaism is not an American religion, But I really, I think that was there was just one moment when I said, "Okay, that's going to be my subtitle." But I would say that the biggest emotionally personal takeaway for this book was just a sense of admiration and being really touched by the people that I got to know in the book on all sides, from Isaac Manuel Wise, who was a bombastic, kind of Trumpian character, actually. By the way, he's one of the central characters of the book, but it's interesting that Isaac Manuel Wise's daughter married Adolf Ochs. So all the Sulzbergers, who I worked for 40 years at the New York Times, they're descended from the central character of this book as much as they are from Adolf Ochs. But I also became very touched by Isaac Leeser, who was his frenemy, who was his traditionalist critic, but on sometimes ally, and who was the foremost and brilliant exponent of traditional Judaism. And I found his life story incredibly moving. And Felix Adler, who then went off the deep end and became an atheist, even though he was expected to become the rabbi at Temple Emmanuel and succeed his father. I just found all the journeys that these characters in the book, and the women also, Rebecca Gratz, who founded the Sunday schools in America. And I found myself very moved learning about these people.
We didn't really get into the role of women, and we don't have time to. And I think that with conservatives and Reform Judaism, it's not really an issue. It is with the Orthodox. But I just wanted to ask you, and this is my final question, about your own personal life, because you were not particularly observant growing up. And yet, when you got married, and Steve is married to the fabulous Elizabeth Buemiller, Elizabeth is not Jewish. Elizabeth arranges flowers for the National Cathedral.
You've been outed.
You wanted your children to be raised Jewish. Why was that? Why did it matter to you?
Well, I can't articulate why it mattered to me, but I have to say that my wife understood that it mattered to me more than I understood it. And so when we got married, there was never any question that she was going to convert or anything like that. I never wanted that. I love her tradition and her Episcopal. I've learned a lot from her family and her teachings. But she said to me, "I want to raise our children as Jewish, but guess what? You're going to have to do it." I mean, she schlepped them, to Hebrew school, and she does beautiful seders, as some of you know. But I felt obligated to do something to set an example. I don't want to say that my parents were anything less than wonderful about this, but I felt that I needed to set an example for my children and study my religion and as the best way to inculcate with them the significance of it. So it was out of that this book grew. And of course now my daughter will refer to this book as Dad's Jew book. But I love her for it.
But you're observant. You go, you do the Seder, you go to Yom Kippur. I've been lucky enough to be your guest many years in a row, going to Yom Kippur with you. Do you think that you have become more Jewish as you've gotten older? I know a lot of people do sort of go back to their original religion, or at least become more observant.
Yeah, I don't consider myself to be more observant, but I would have to say that my Jewish identity means more to me now than it ever did.
And do you think that you have been changed by writing this book, and that you are more, that Judaism means more to you now because of the book?
Yes, I do. And I think you can see that.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. So
I think you said that South Carolina was the place where most Jewish people resided. How is that possible? I mean, they didn't convert. So how is it possible that all those people went south and not some other section of the U.S.?
It's a good question. So the tradition of Jews in Europe was to gather in ports, and that's why there was a large Jewish community in Amsterdam, and Charleston was the major trading post, on the East Coast in the early 19th century. It was very well located. They traded all over the Atlantic, up and down the coast. All kinds of exotic foods and cotton, and of course slaves. And Jews participated in that trading, and that's one of the reasons that drew them to South Carolina and to Charleston.
I'm curious. You've talked about the Sephardic Jews a little and the German Jews a lot. But do you also talk about the Russian Jews who came in 1890 to 1910? 4 of my grandparents came from there, because their history is different. They came in the 30s. They tried, some of my parents' friends tried to be not Jewish at all. There was a lot of anti-Semitism. And then there was World War II and the Holocaust, and I think that changed a lot of Jews' attitudes towards Israel. Yes.
So the simple answer to your question is that I didn't want the book to be longer than it already is. So it more or less ends in around 1900, just as the Jews from Russia and Eastern Europe arrived. The thesis of the book is that although we think that the forces in the 20th century that you mentioned did shape Jewish identity for sure, and Jewish political views for sure, and Jewish attitudes towards Zionism for sure. However, what I wanted to do in this book is to show that contrary to maybe conventional wisdom, the 19th century was where the foundations of American Judaism were laid, and eventually the 2 million or so Jews that came starting in the 1880s, they inherited that foundation. They made it something new. They revived it. But it is that foundation that continues to characterize American Judaism today.
So you can do volume 2.
I'll be back in 10 years.
So with all the divisions and the conflicts, and thinking back to even the time of Ezra, from that time on, and with the disagreements about the Talmud, the literal Talmud, and the disagreements about the temple, and all of the disagreements that you have mentioned, would you say that there is a central kernel of unanimity among all the divisions, the religious divisions and the national divisions? Would you identify one thing that is at the heart of it all that brings everybody together?
Well, yes. I think that belief in God, although is the central belief of all Jews. But even those
There's
who
so many Jews
who don't believe, I was about to
There's
say,
so many-
even those Jews who don't believe in God,
Right.
are drawn to that aspect of Jewish identity. My friend Walter Isaacson, in his biography of Albert Einstein, describes Albert Einstein as an atheist who believed in God, because Einstein felt there was some unification or unity of the universe. There was something to understand that he kept searching for. So I do think that even though literally Jews, many of them say that I can't believe in God and are still searchers, as Sally writes in her book, she never liked the term seeking or searching, but I think that searching for that meaning and for that ideal is what unifies Judaism.
Well, I don't know. I know of quite a few colleagues who would disagree about belief in that sense. Now, what about the concept of Shabbat? Is that not, dating back to Ezra, the one thing that all observant Jews would affirm?
Yes, I think so, but not all of us. It's more honored in the breach, as they say.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very fascinating. You almost answered my question or addressed it when you talked about sort of the geographic loyalty, I guess, of Jews in the South and in the North at the time of the Civil War. But you didn't directly say anything about the issue of slavery among Jews. Was there any difference? Were Jews any different in the fraction that were sort of concerned about the morality of slavery versus those that saw it as an economic necessity or whatever? How did the issue of slavery play out among conservative Jews versus not so conservative Jews?
Did everyone hear the question? It was about slavery. Yeah, I tried to wrestle with that in the book. Jews were as conflicted about the morality of slavery as many people were at the time. And even Isaac Manuel Wise and other so-called liberal or reform Jews didn't object to slavery that much. And a lot of Jews in New York were dependent on the cotton trades, and New York was a Confederate. Was sympathized with the Confederacy. The mayor of New York during the Civil War wanted to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy. So, but the interesting thing about your question to me that I tried to deal with in the book were the doctrinal debates about slavery, because there was one of the most respected rabbis in America who was from New York, Morris Rafal, gave a whole sermon just on the eve of the Civil War, justifying slavery and saying that anyone who thinks that Jews have to be against slavery is crazy. There's lots of slavery in the Bible. I mean, Abraham had slaves. A lot of the Talmud discusses how you should treat your slaves. So obviously, he said slavery is fine if you're Jewish. Well, his main antagonist, David Einhorn, who was one of the founders of the Reform movement, gave his own sermon that rebutting that. And not only, I mean, obviously you would cite Exodus and the story of Jews being slaves themselves, but what this demonstrated to me, this was really interesting because it was an argument about text, and Jews have always argued about text. What do the words mean? And the fact that Jews during the Civil War could argue about text, and that so many of them could find in the Bible justification for slavery, that discredited the text-driven part of Judaism in the eyes of many Jews. Like, enough already with the text. Slavery is immoral, and and that's that. All the rest is commentary.
Stephen, I meant to ask you about slavery, but you had some other explanations that I thought were interesting. One of them was that there were very few Jewish slave owners because most of them didn't have plantations. Most of them were in sort of mercantile endeavors. And also that those who did have slaves, a lot of them did it because they didn't want to seem like the other. They didn't want to be not with they didn't want to go up against their Southern compatriots by turning against slavery, because they wanted to be a part of that. And also that a lot of the Jews who did have slaves treated them well.
Well, most of the texts that that your kids get in Sunday school or whatever, embrace the idea, oh, well, the Jews were slave owners, but they treated them well. And I don't know that there's any evidence that that's true or not true, but it is an article of, Jewish teachings nowadays. But just as there have been revisionism in the Civil War revisionism, starting in the 1960s, when America itself came to terms with the history of slavery and Reconstruction, so Jews have also, in the last many decades, the last 50 years, looked more searchingly at the Jewish role in the slave trade and in slave owning, and have had to come to terms with the fact that Jews did own slaves, they did engage in the slave trade, not disproportionately, as some anti-Semitic writings would suggest, but, they did. And, Judah Benjamin, like you said, when he was up and coming in Louisiana as a politician, it's possible that he acquired slaves, and a plantation. He did it for his wife. He wanted to be a big man in Louisiana, and that was part of it.
Thank you. Thanks.
So I have a question, Steve. You end the book on a kind of uplifted note, saying that, given some of the issues that the Jews today are facing, ranging from assimilation to Israel, they should take heart in the way that they dealt with these challenges in the 18th and 19th century and not only survived but flourished. Would you elaborate on that? I mean, what are the lessons that should be drawn from that earlier experience that would apply today?
I think, just like the era that we're going through now with in the era of Donald Trump, you have people like John Meacham, who is trying to tell us, don't lose your cool. We've been through this before. We've been through really bad times before. We come out usually in a better place. And I just chose to echo that hopeful tone in my conclusion of my book, which you're kind enough to mention. I can't prove that that's going to be true, but I do think that the more we study the past and the conflicts of the past, the more we can appreciate and put into context our conflicts today. I mean, and these conflicts were big. I mean, the Maccabees and the Hellenizers, in the Hasmonean era, that was huge. And you actually can go to Israel today and hear Orthodox Jews refer contemptuously to secularized Jews as Helleni. I mean, it still echoes through Jewish history. So I just think understanding our past makes us better prepared to cope with the present.
Thank you. So this is exactly what I want to say. Yeah. Can I ask? Yes. Yeah. So this is exactly what I want to say. Like Hanukkah is very characteristic about Judaism in general, okay? So Hanukkah was actually a civil war between Hellenized and traditional Jews. Exactly this. And there are all kind of myths about this. For example, like the many are the few against the many, which is a myth. It's not true. It's not true. Because the Greeks were occupied in other places. So it was easier for the Maccabees to fight. And now the Hanukkah, the holiday itself, it was not a holiday. It was a gathering for soldiers. And over the years, it became a holiday. And all kind of things like the myth about the oil, yes? This was, again, a small legend somewhere in the Talmud.
Yeah. Well, you make a good point. And I think you could write a whole book about Hanukkah. But the effect of Greek culture on Judaism in antiquity is huge, and both good and from the point of view of traditionalists bad, because the Jews who lived in the Holy Land parts of Alexander the Great's empire, when it broke up and the Seleucids took over, they had strayed from Jewish practices. They were eating pork. They had statues of gods. They
fought naked.
They wrestled naked in the gymnasium, and maybe there was a little bit of homosexuality, going on. So you can imagine, you can see the Maccabees as kind of the Taliban of their day. They were horrified by this, and they conquered the area, and they retained control of. It was the last time the Jews really, until Israel, were in charge, but. I gather from the histories I've read that Jewish behavior didn't change much even after the Maccabees took over.
Yeah, and we have time for one more
just the comment
question.
About the Greek influence, because the Bible has exactly 8,000 different Hebrew words, and today the language contains 3,000 Greek words.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that.
One more question.
Jonathan Weisman.
Okay, I just want to ask a contemporary question here. To go back to your notion of American Judaism as, in some ways, its own religion. And as you know, that the Israeli government right now is really kind of defining Judaism as an Orthodox religion. And they've spent a lot of effort to distance what their conception of Judaism from Reform Judaism and even conservative Judaism in the United States. So my question is, do you think that without Israel, can American Judaism survive as its own religion if Israel is intent on distancing itself from us? Like our rabbi says, we love Israel, but Israel might not love us so much.
Yeah. I think the answer to that is yes, but I think we are at a point of a great schism. That historians of Judaism are going to, we don't know how it's going to turn out. But I do think that these two largest Jewish communities in the world are drifting apart. Now, obviously, there are secularized Jews in Israel. I mean, everybody, the joke in Israel is that all Jews, let's see, the Orthodox shul is the one that the Israeli Jews don't go to. I'm not an expert on the situation of Judaism itself in Israel, but it does seem to me that we're at a historic inflection point, and historians are going to maybe see that they're becoming almost two different religions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Sally.
Thank you all for coming. Everybody should buy this book.